Chapter 1. The Last Train from Holworth. The fog had rolled in from the moors an hour before midnight, curling about the gas lamps of Holworth Junction like something with intention rather than mere weather. Captain Arthur Hastings, newly returned from a fortnight's fishing in Scotland and thoroughly out of temper with the entire British rail system, stood upon the platform and reflected that he had never seen a station so thoroughly committed to atmosphere. "You would think," he muttered to his travelling companion, "that they might have built the waiting room somewhat nearer the platform." Hercule Poirot, swathed in a heavy coat against the damp, did not so much as glance at him. His attention, as it so often was, had fixed itself upon a fellow traveller some 20 feet distant, a stout gentleman in an astrakhan collar, pacing with the particular agitation of a man who has misplaced something of value or who fears he soon shall. "That man, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, "is afraid." "Afraid of missing the train, I should think. We all are. It's nearly midnight." "Non, he does not watch the clock. He watches the other passengers." Poirot's dark eyes, bright as a bird's despite the hour, moved with unhurried precision from one figure to the next upon the fog-shrouded platform. "Observe, mon ami. We have here a most curious little gathering for a midnight train to London." Hastings followed his friend's gaze and saw, indeed, an oddly composed assembly. The stout man in the astrakhan collar, introduced moments earlier to the station-master as one Mr. Reginald Carfax, continued his agitated circuit. Near the ticket office stood a sharp-featured young woman in a severe grey travelling suit, her gloved hands folded with a stillness that seemed deliberate rather than natural. A clergyman with silver hair sat upon a bench, reading, or pretending to read, a slim black volume. Two others, a married couple, by their matching luggage and the husband's protective hand at his wife's elbow, conversed in low tones near the platform's edge, though something in their postures suggested an argument recently abandoned rather than a conversation freely begun. And there, emerging from the first-class waiting room with the unhurried gait of a man entirely satisfied with his place in the world, came Mr. Edmund Hartley Price, financier, collector of rare manuscripts, and, as Hastings would shortly learn, a man with rather more enemies than his cheerful countenance suggested. "Carfax!" Hartley Price called out, raising a gloved hand. "Still pacing, I see. You'll wear a groove in the platform." Carfax did not answer. He had gone, Hastings noted, rather pale. The train itself, the 11:58, the last connection to London before the morning service, stood waiting, with the patient hiss of banked steam, 6 carriages long, its windows glowing amber through the murk. "Poirot," Hastings said slowly, "you don't suppose anything is going to happen tonight?" "Mon cher Hastings." Poirot's moustaches twitched in what might, in a lesser man, have been amusement. "Something is always about to happen. It is merely a question of whether one is paying attention when it does." He said nothing further, but as the guard's whistle sounded thin and lonely through the fog, and the 6 passengers, along with Poirot and Hastings, boarded the waiting carriages, Poirot paused upon the step, looking back once at the empty platform behind them, as though counting something that did not quite add up. The train pulled away from Holworth Junction at 1 minute past midnight. By 20 past, Edmund Hartley Price was dead. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The discovery had been Hastings's own, and he was not likely to forget it soon. He had gone forward at the second stop, a brief pause at Millbrook Halt, to fetch Poirot a cup of the dreadful station tea his friend professed to despise, and yet somehow always requested, and had found the door of the end compartment standing very slightly ajar, swaying with the motion of the train. Within, slumped against the window, with his rare manuscripts still clutched in a leather case upon his knee, sat Edmund Hartley Price, quite dead, his face composed in an expression of mild surprise, as though death had interrupted him mid-sentence. There was no blood, no visible wound. Only, upon the small fold-out table before him, an overturned glass and the faint, unmistakable bitterness of almonds beneath the staler smell of railway upholstery. Poirot had taken charge with characteristic swiftness, instructing the guard to halt the train at the next station, a small junction called Ferro Cross, and to permit no passenger to disembark until the local police could be summoned. It was, Hastings reflected, rather a tall order for a country constabulary at 1 in the morning, but Poirot's manner brooked no argument, even from men twice his size, and considerably more accustomed to giving orders than receiving them. Now, some 40 minutes later, the 6 remaining passengers sat assembled in the dim, smoke-fogged dining carriage, watched over by a young constable who appeared to wish himself anywhere else in England. Poirot stood at the carriage's head, hands folded behind him, surveying the company with the placid attention of a man examining a board of chess pieces not yet committed to their opening moves. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he began, "I am aware that the hour is late and the circumstances most distressing. I will not delay you longer than is necessary. But a man is dead, and until the cause of that death is understood, none of us shall reach London with an easy conscience." "Surely," said the clergyman, whose name proved to be the Reverend Josiah Pemberton, "it was his heart. The poor man's colour had seemed unwell to me even on the platform." "Hearts, monsieur, do not generally smell of bitter almonds." Poirot's tone remained mild, but something in it caused the carriage to go very still. "I think we may say with some confidence that Monsieur Hartley Price did not die a natural death." Mrs. Caroline Verrall, the woman in the grey travelling suit, who had introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to stating facts and having them believed, folded her gloved hands more tightly. "Are you suggesting one of us is responsible?" "I am suggesting nothing, madame. I am observing only that 6 people boarded a train with a 7th, and that the 7th now lies dead in a locked compartment, the door of which was found ajar by my good friend Hastings some 20 minutes after our departure from Halworth. It is a fact. Facts, I find, are best examined before they are explained away." "This is monstrous!" Carfax burst out, mopping his brow despite the carriage's chill. "We're decent people, sir. I run a perfectly respectable export business." "Mais oui, monsieur. I do not doubt it." Poirot's eyes, however, lingered on Carfax a fraction longer than courtesy required. The married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Denholm, as they gave their name, sat close together, and it was the husband, a lean, anxious man with prematurely greying temples, who spoke next. "We scarcely knew the man, a passing acquaintance only. My wife and I have business in London tomorrow, urgent business, and I should like to know how long we are to be detained." "Until the truth is known, monsieur. No longer, and, I assure you, no shorter." It was the silence of the 6th passenger that struck Hastings most forcibly. A young man near the carriage door, travelling alone, who had given his name simply as Mr. Gerald Finch, and offered nothing further, neither occupation, nor destination, nor any word of protest at the delay, sat with his eyes fixed upon the floor, his hands, Hastings noticed, trembling very slightly in his lap. Poirot had noticed it too. Hastings could see it in the slight incline of his friend's head, the faint narrowing of those bright, dark eyes. "Eh bien," Poirot said softly, almost to himself. 6 passengers, 6 stories, and 1 dead man who can tell us none of his own. We shall see, mes amis. We shall see. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and the train sat motionless upon the tracks, waiting. Chapter 3. Poirot takes command. Inspector Japp, or rather, in this remote corner of the country, his provincial counterpart, a weathered, deliberate man named Inspector Maddox, arrived at Ferro Cross Station within the hour, summoned by telephone from the station-master's office, and plainly unaccustomed to corpses appearing on his quiet stretch of line. He found Poirot already in possession of the dead man's compartment, down upon his knees, an indignity he bore with remarkable good humour, examining the carriage floor with the aid of Hastings's pocket torch. "Now then," Maddox said, drawing himself up in the doorway with the air of a man reclaiming territory. "And who might you be, sir?" Hercule Poirot, at your service, Inspector. And this is my friend, Captain Hastings. We were, by the most unfortunate coincidence, fellow passengers. Maddox's brows rose with evident recognition. Poirot, the Belgian detective. I read of you in the Yard's bulletins. Well, he cleared his throat, somewhat mollified. Can't say I'm sorry for the assistance, sir, though I'll thank you not to touch anything further till my men have had their look. But of course, Inspector, I have touched nothing, merely observed. Poirot rose, dusting his knees with fastidious care, and gestured toward the small table. You will find, I think, that the glass contained a quantity of brandy, and within the brandy a quantity of cyanide. The almond scent is unmistakable to the trained nose, though I do not doubt your surgeon will confirm it more scientifically. Cyanide, Maddox repeated grimly, peering at the overturned glass without touching it. Quick-acting stuff. Wouldn't take more than a minute or two. Précisément, which tells us something of considerable importance, Inspector, namely that whoever administered it either watched him drink it or knew with certainty that he would do so very soon after it was given to him. This was not a poison left to chance. It was a poison delivered with confidence. Maddox frowned, working through the implication. Meaning someone was in this compartment with him. Meaning, at the very least, that someone was confident enough of an opportunity that they did not fear discovery. The compartment door, you understand, was unlocked from within. My friend Hastings found it ajar, not forced. Either Monsieur Hartley Price admitted his killer freely, as one might admit an acquaintance for a private word, or, Poirot paused, one finger raised. The killer required no permission at all, because they were known to him, and trusted. Could have poisoned himself, of course, Maddox offered, though without much conviction. Wealthy men get into difficulties, debts, disgrace. It is possible, Inspector, and I do not discount it merely because it is inconvenient to my own curiosity. But a man who takes his own life rarely does so with a half-read manuscript open upon his lap and an expression of mild surprise upon his face, as though death had arrived a moment before he expected a different sort of visitor entirely. Poirot's eyes glinted. Non. I think Monsieur Hartley Price expected company tonight. I think he was not disappointed, until it was, alas, too late to matter. Maddox studied the small, immaculate Belgian with new and grudging respect. You've a theory already, then? I have observations, Inspector, which is not at all the same thing, though I confess the temptation to confuse the two is one I resist with some effort. Poirot smiled faintly. I have 6 passengers in your dining carriage, each with a story, and I have not yet had the pleasure of testing those stories against one another. Until I have done so, I prefer to keep my theories, such as they are, to myself. And in the meantime, Inspector, I should be very grateful if you would permit me to speak with each of them in turn. Privately, if such a thing can be arranged. There is much that a person will say to one stranger that they would never say before a company of 5 others who might judge them for it. Maddox considered this, then nodded slowly. Station master's office is free. I'll have my constable fetch them one at a time. Excellent. Poirot turned back toward the dead man's still form with something almost like an apology in his expression. Do not concern yourself further, monsieur, he murmured. I shall not rest until I have learned who did this to you, and why. Behind him, Hastings shivered, though whether from the cold night air or some less tangible chill, he could not afterward have said. Chapter 4. 6 Stories, 6 Silences. The station-master's office at Ferro Cross was a cramped, paraffin-scented room, but Poirot took possession of it as though it were a salon at the Ritz, settling himself behind the small desk, with Hastings stationed unobtrusively by the window, notebook in hand. Reginald Carfax came first, still mopping at his brow, though the room was, if anything, rather cold. I want it understood, he began before Poirot had said a word, that I had no quarrel whatsoever with Hartley Price. None. We were acquainted. Business circles, you understand. One meets everyone eventually, but nothing beyond the ordinary courtesies. I have asked you nothing yet, monsieur, Poirot observed mildly. and already you defend yourself with such vigor. Tell me instead, what is the nature of your business? Export, textiles mainly, Manchester goods, sent out to the continent. Carfax's hands, Hastings noted, would not quite be still. I don't see what that has to do with anything. Perhaps nothing at all. Yet I find, monsieur, that a man's business often shapes his anxieties, and you are a man with anxieties this evening that go beyond the discomfort of a delayed train. Poirot leaned forward very slightly. You watched the platform at Halworth with great attention. You watched, in particular, for someone. Who was it you feared to see, Monsieur Carfax? The colour drained from Carfax's already pale countenance. That is, a man in my line sees a great many faces, creditors, disappointed partners. It means nothing. Then I shall trouble you no further on the point, for the moment. Poirot's tone made it clear the reprieve was temporary, and Carfax left the office looking considerably less steady than he had entered it. Mrs. Caroline Verrill proved an altogether different proposition, composed, precise, and disinclined toward unnecessary speech. She confirmed, when asked, that she was a solicitor's clerk travelling to London on a family matter, and that she had exchanged no more than a polite greeting with the dead man at the ticket counter. You did not know him previously? I did not, Monsieur Poirot. A pause, brief but noticeable. Though, I confess, his name was not unfamiliar to me. One hears things, in my profession, about men of business. What things, madame? Things I should prefer not to repeat without better cause than idle curiosity. And on that, despite Poirot's gentlest persuasions, she would not be moved. The Reverend Pemberton, when his turn came, proved garrulous, where Mrs. Verrall had been guarded, speaking at considerable length of Providence, mortality, and the uncertain hour of man's passing, without once answering the question Poirot had actually posed regarding his own acquaintance with the deceased. A tragedy, the clergyman concluded, folding his hands. A young man, comparatively, and gifted, they tell me, in matters of art and antiquity. I understand he dealt in rare manuscripts, a noble pursuit, though I have heard it said that such trades are not always conducted with noble methods. You have heard this said by whom, Monsieur le Curé? But Pemberton only smiled with infuriating serenity, and observed that a man of the cloth heard a great many things in the course of his pastoral duties, very few of which he felt at liberty to repeat. The Denholmes, husband and wife, were interviewed together at Mr. Denholme's insistence, a request Poirot granted with apparent equanimity, though Hastings suspected it told him something in itself. We barely knew the man, Denholme repeated, his wife nodding in close agreement beside him. A nodding acquaintance, nothing more. Yet when Poirot inquired, almost in passing, whether either of them had visited the dead man's compartment during the journey, it was Mrs. Denholme who answered a half-second too quickly, and her husband who glanced at her with an expression Hastings could not quite name, not suspicion, precisely, but something adjacent to it. Certainly not, she said. We remained in our own compartment the entire time. Last of all came Gerald Finch, pale and silent, who answered each question in monosyllables, and would not meet Poirot's eye, admitting only, when pressed, that he had never before tonight exchanged a single word with Edmund Hartley Price. When the young man had gone, Poirot sat for a long moment in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him. 6 stories, Hastings, he said at last, and not one of them, I think, entirely true. Chapter 5. The First False Lead. By the time the grey light of dawn crept through the fog over Ferro Cross, Inspector Maddox had assembled what he plainly regarded as a satisfactory conclusion to the matter. "It's Carfax," he announced to Poirot, drawing him aside near the platform's small waiting room, while the constables saw to the removal of the body. "My men searched the compartments, as you suggested, found this tucked beneath the cushion in Carfax's seat." He produced, with the triumphant air of a conjurer, a small glass vial, empty, its stopper missing. "Smells exactly as you said, bitter almonds." And there's more. We've wired ahead to London. Carfax owed Hartley Price a considerable sum, nearly £4,000, lost in some manuscript venture that went sour. Hartley Price had threatened to expose him to his creditors and ruin the export business entirely. Motive, method, and now the means, found in his own seat. Hastings, standing nearby, felt a surge of satisfaction. That does seem rather conclusive, Poirot. Does it, mon ami? Poirot turned the vial over in his gloved fingers, without touching its surface directly, studying it with the faint frown of a man examining a forgery he suspects but cannot yet prove. "Tell me, Inspector, was the vial hidden or merely placed?" Maddox blinked. "Beg pardon?" "Hidden, monsieur, implies effort, a man pushing an object deep into a space where searching eyes are unlikely to find it without considerable diligence. Placed implies something altogether different, an object left where it would be found by anyone troubling to look even cursorily beneath a cushion. Which was it?" The inspector considered. "Can't say it took much finding, now you mention it. Constable had it out within a minute of starting his search." "Just so." Poirot handed the vial back, with the delicate distaste of a man returning something faintly distasteful. "Monsieur Carfax, whatever his sins, and I do not doubt he has several, struck me as a man of considerable nervous agitation, but not, I think, of carelessness. A man who poisons his creditor and then permits the murder weapon to repose beneath his own cushion, where the most indifferent search must discover it within moments, is either remarkably stupid or remarkably unfortunate. I do not yet know Monsieur Carfax to be the former, and I distrust altogether too thoroughly the convenience of the latter." "You think someone put it there," Hastings said slowly, "to implicate him. I think, Hastings, that we have been presented with a conclusion rather too neatly wrapped for my taste, like a Christmas parcel arriving a fortnight early. It makes me suspicious of the sender, not grateful for the gift." Maddox, to his credit, did not dismiss the objection outright, though his expression suggested a man reluctant to abandon a solution that had promised him an early breakfast and a closed file. "Even so, Monsieur Poirot, motive and weapon together are no small thing. The Yard would call it sufficient. The Yard, Inspector, is not always wrong, but neither is it always right, and in this instance I would ask only a few hours' patience before the matter is closed beyond recall. Permit me to speak with Monsieur Carfax once more, and with the others besides. If I am mistaken in my doubts, you shall have lost nothing but a little of your morning. If I am correct, you shall have spared an innocent man, however unpleasant a one, from the gallows for a crime committed by another." Maddox's jaw worked for a moment, weighing professional pride against the plain good sense of the proposal. "An hour, Monsieur Poirot, no more. I've a superintendent who'll want this concluded by noon." "An hour," Poirot agreed, "is all I require to begin. Whether it is all I require to finish, that, mon ami, is a different question entirely." As Maddox strode off to inform his superiors of the brief delay, Hastings turned to his friend with the particular frown he reserved for moments of genuine bewilderment. "If not Carfax, then who? You can't simply have a feeling about it, Poirot." "Can I not?" Poirot's eyes glinted with something between amusement and gravity. "Ah, Hastings, it is not a feeling, it is an observation, and observations, properly assembled, become certainties. Someone aboard that train wished very much for us to look no further than Reginald Carfax's frightened face and his foolish debts. That is the most interesting fact I have yet uncovered, and I think, mon ami, it is time I asked that person a question they will not enjoy answering." Chapter 6. The Psychological Game. Poirot did not, as Hastings had expected, return immediately to question Carfax. Instead, he requested that all 6 passengers be gathered once more in the dining carriage, now still and cold upon the siding where the train had been shunted for the convenience of the investigation, and there he addressed them as a body, with the particular theatrical patience of a man setting bait and prepared to wait, however long necessary, for it to be taken. "Mesdames, Monsieur, I have news that I think will interest you. The inspector has discovered, Hidden within Monsieur Carfax's compartment, the vial which once held the poison that killed your fellow traveller. A ripple went through the assembled company. Carfax himself, seated near the window, went rigid, his mouth opening in protest that Poirot silenced with a raised hand. "Non, monsieur, do not trouble yourself to deny it yet. I have not finished." The inspector is naturally inclined to consider the matter closed. A vial, a motive, a debt of £4,000. These are satisfying things to a policeman who wishes his breakfast. Poirot paused, surveying the carriage with the unhurried attention of a hawk circling a hedgerow. I, however, am not so easily satisfied. I find myself troubled by a small detail, so small that I hesitate even to mention it, except that my little grey cells will not leave it in peace. What detail? The question came from Mrs. Virral. Her composure, Hastings noticed, very slightly less perfect than before. "Merely this, madame. The vial was found with remarkable ease. Too much ease, I think, for an object meant to remain hidden. It troubles me because it suggests that someone wished it to be found, someone who understood that the discovery of poison in Monsieur Carfax's compartment would end all further inquiry rather neatly. And such a person, you understand, would need to have known three things: that Monsieur Carfax owed money to the dead man, that this debt was substantial enough to constitute a motive, and that the vial itself would not be searched for in any other compartment, because the matter would be considered already resolved." The silence that followed was profound. Poirot let it stretch, his dark eyes moving slowly from face to face. Carfax, ashen and trembling. Mrs. Virral, very still. Pemberton, his expression carefully arranged into pious concern. The Denholms, hands now visibly entwined, and Finch, who had not lifted his gaze from the floor since entering the carriage. "It is a curious thing," Poirot continued softly, almost conversationally, "how much a guilty conscience and an innocent one can resemble each other from the outside, n'est-ce pas? Both produce pale faces, both produce trembling hands, both produce silence where speech might be expected. I have learned, over many years and many such carriages as this one, that the true test is not in the trembling itself, but in what a person trembles to protect." He turned, with deliberate slowness, toward Gerald Finch. "You, monsieur, have said almost nothing to me since this affair began. You knew nothing of the dead man, you tell me, and yet, when the inspector mentioned the matter of the debt just now, I observed that you did not look toward Monsieur Carfax at all, as the others did, quite naturally, out of curiosity. You looked, instead, toward the window, toward your own reflection, perhaps. Why is that, I wonder?" Finch's head came up sharply, colour flooding his pale cheeks. There's no reason. None at all. I simply—" He stopped himself, swallowing whatever protest had risen, and Hastings saw, with a small thrill of recognition, that Poirot's barb had found something, even if its precise shape remained obscure. "No, monsieur, do not trouble yourself to finish. I do not ask for an answer this moment, merely that you consider the question at your leisure, for I assure you I shall return to it." Poirot's gaze swept the carriage once more, gathering every face into his consideration, like a man counting cards already memorized. "I will say only this to you all. Someone among you has constructed a most clever arrangement of guilt, designed to fall upon a man who is, whatever his faults, not the architect of Edmund Hartley Price's death. I do not yet know which of you it is, but I promise you, I shall." He inclined his head with perfect courtesy, as though concluding a pleasant after-dinner conversation, and left the carriage with Hastings hurrying in his wake, leaving behind 6 passengers and a silence considerably more uneasy than the one in which he had found them. Chapter 7. The Missing Witness. It was Inspector Maddox who brought the news. Some 20 minutes later, his weathered face set in lines of fresh alarm that told Hastings, even before a word was spoken, that the morning's complications had not yet reached their conclusion. Monsieur Poirot. Maddox found them in the small waiting room, where Poirot had been engaged in the meticulous refolding of his pocket handkerchief, a habit Hastings had long since learned to recognize as the outward sign of intense inward thought. "There's a problem. The dining car attendant, chap by the name of Albert Soames, he's gone." Poirot's hands stilled upon the handkerchief. "Gone, Inspector? Gone where?" "That's the trouble, sir. Nobody's seen him since before we reached Ferro Cross. My constable went to take his statement. Routine, you understand, since he'd have served drinks to the dead man and might recall something useful, and found his quarters empty. Coat gone. No sign of him on the train, on the platform, anywhere along the line so far as we can tell." "This is the man," Poirot said slowly, "who would have carried the brandy to Monsieur Hartley Price's compartment, if such service was requested." "That's just it, sir. According to the other staff, Soames had specifically taken charge of that end of the carriage tonight, said the regular man was feeling poorly and he'd cover the shift. Seemed ordinary enough at the time. Nobody thought twice about it." Hastings felt the small, cold thrill of a man watching a puzzle's true shape begin, at last, to emerge from beneath its scattered pieces. "Poirot, if this man volunteered for that section of the carriage, and now he's vanished entirely, then he is either our murderer fleeing the scene of his crime," Poirot finished, rising from his chair with sudden energy, "or he is a witness who knows considerably more than is safe for him to know, and has concluded, perhaps correctly, that his continued presence aboard this train constitutes a danger to his health." "Inspector, what is known of this Albert Soames, his history, his character, his employment with the railway?" Maddox consulted his notebook with the air of a man wishing he had asked these questions an hour earlier. "Been with the company 8 months, sir. Before that, nothing on record. The personnel office at the junction wired through what little they had. No family listed. No permanent address beyond a boarding house in London that, when we rang through, claimed never to have heard the name. A man, then, who arrived from nowhere 8 months ago, took up a position that placed him in regular proximity to wealthy travellers, and who tonight contrived, by his own arrangement, you say, to serve precisely the carriage in which Edmund Hartley Price would shortly die." Poirot's eyes had taken on the particular brightness Hastings associated with the scent of real progress. "Inspector, I think we must discover a great deal more about Monsieur Soames, and with some urgency. Has the line been searched? The surrounding fields?" "Sending men out now, sir. Though in this fog, I'll be honest, I don't hold much hope of tracking him before noon." "Then we must proceed by other means." Poirot turned to Hastings, something resolved and purposeful settling over his features. "Mon ami, I think the time has come to revisit our 6 passengers once more, not as a body, this time, but individually, and with a question I have, until now, withheld. For there is one among them, I am quite certain, who knew Albert Soames considerably better than a stranger ought to know a dining car attendant. And I think, moreover, that this same person did not expect him to vanish at all, which means his disappearance has thrown a carefully laid plan into a disorder that may, if we are skillful and swift, work very much to our advantage." "You think he was meant to stay? To be found, perhaps, blamed even, in Carfax's place, if the vial hadn't served?" "I think, Hastings," Poirot said, moving toward the door with brisk new purpose, "that a man who vanishes in the night, leaving no trace and no farewell, has either betrayed someone or been betrayed himself. And I find I am most extremely curious to determine which it was, and at whose hand." Outside, the fog had begun at last to lift, though what light it revealed brought no comfort to the matter at hand. Only the bare, frost-rimmed fields stretching empty in every direction, offering no sign of the missing man at all. Chapter 8. The Hidden Clue. Poirot's second round of interviews proceeded with a different temper than the first. Shorter, sharper, each question aimed with the precision of a man who no longer fishes blindly, but casts toward a shape he can already, faintly, discern beneath the water. It was during his examination of Mrs. Denholm, conducted, This time, without her husband present, a separation she accepted with visible reluctance, that Poirot's patience yielded its reward. "Madame, I ask you again, and I ask you to consider most carefully before you answer. Did you know the dining car attendant, Albert Soames?" "I have already said." "You have already said a great many things, madame, none of which, I think, were entirely truthful. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I have observed that you possess a small habit. When a question troubles you, your right hand moves to touch the clasp of your handbag, as though reassuring yourself that something within it remains secure. You have done this twice now, both times when I have spoken the name of Albert Soames." Mrs. Denholm's hand, which had indeed strayed once more toward the bag in her lap, froze. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Hastings, watching from his post by the window, held his breath along with her. "He is my brother," she said at last, very quietly. "My younger brother. We have not used the same name in some years. Family circumstances, you understand, of a sort I would rather not detail. He took the position on this line some months ago, at my urging, because he had fallen into difficulties, and I hoped honest work might set him right again. And your husband, does he know this?" "He knows I have a brother. He does not know that brother travels on this very line, under another name, nor that I recognized him the moment he entered our carriage tonight to take our order." Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the long night, had begun at last to fracture, like ice under a patient weight. "I said nothing, Monsieur Poirot, because I did not wish my husband to learn of family matters I have spent years concealing from him. That is my only sin in this. I swear it. Did your brother speak to you tonight, beyond the ordinary courtesies of his position, a hesitation, brief but telling? He passed close by our table once, after serving Mr. Hartley Price his brandy. He murmured, only a few words, you understand, nothing I properly understood at the time. He said, 'I have done what was asked of me, Carrie. Now it is done, and I want no part of what follows.' I thought he meant some matter of service, some complaint from a difficult passenger. I did not understand, until this very moment, what he might truly have meant." Poirot was very still. "Those words, madame, precisely. You are certain of them, as certain as I am of my own name." Her eyes, when she lifted them to his, were wet with something that might have been grief or fear, or both entwined past separating. "Monsieur Poirot, I beg you, whatever my brother has done, he was not its author. He used those words, asked of me. Someone asked it of him, someone else entirely." Poirot rose slowly from his chair, and Hastings saw in his friend's face the particular stillness that came only at the threshold of true understanding. Not triumph, not yet, but the quiet certainty of a man who has, at last, located the single loose thread that will unravel an entire garment, if only it is pulled with sufficient care. "Madam," he said gently, "you have given me, I think, the very thing I have been searching for since the fog first closed over Halworth Junction. I thank you for your honesty, however reluctantly it arrived." He turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back. "One thing more. When your brother spoke those words, did he look toward anyone in particular, toward any one face among the passengers, as a man might look toward the person he addresses, even when he dares not speak their name aloud?" Mrs. Denholm's reply, when it came, fell upon the small room like a stone into still water. "Yes," she said, "he did." Chapter 9. The Final Gathering. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted entirely, and a pale, watery sunlight fell across the dining carriage, where Poirot had once more summoned all 6 passengers together, this time with Inspector Maddox stationed near the door, and a constable beyond it, should the occasion demand restraint rather than mere conversation. "Mesdames, Messieurs," Poirot began, standing at the carriage's head with his hands folded before him, "I have asked you here for the last time, I think, before this matter is concluded. I will not delay you with unnecessary preamble. A man has died. A vial of poison was found, conveniently, where it might condemn an innocent party. A witness has vanished into the fog, rather than speak the truth he plainly feared to tell, and a woman in this very carriage has, with considerable courage, confessed to me a fact she had every reason to conceal, because she understood, as I think we must all now understand, that the truth, however painful, serves justice better than its absence. Mrs. Denholm sat very pale beside her husband, who had gone rigid with the particular shock of a man learning, in public, what should have been told him in private. Poirot did not pause to soften the moment. There was no kindness, he had often told Hastings, in delaying a wound that must eventually be dealt. Albert Soames, the dining car attendant who has disappeared this night, was no stranger to this carriage. He was brother to Madame Denholm, travelling under an assumed name, and he spoke to her, before his disappearance, words of considerable significance, that he had done what was asked of him, and wished no further part in what followed. He looked, as he said this, toward a particular face among you. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled company with deliberate slowness. I do not yet say whose face that was. I say only that someone in this carriage asked a desperate man, recently fallen into difficulty, to perform a service he came bitterly to regret, and that this same someone, I think, also arranged for a certain vial to be discovered beneath Monsieur Carfax's cushion, that suspicion might fall upon a man already burdened with visible motive, while the true architect of this crime remained unexamined. This is intolerable, Carfax burst out, though with rather less force than his earlier protestations, as though even he had begun to sense the shifting weight of the room's attention away from himself. If you know who did this, sir, I beg you to say so plainly. I am coming to that, monsieur, though I ask your patience a little longer, for there remains one detail I have not yet shared, a detail so small that I confess I nearly overlooked it myself, and which concerns not the poison, nor the vial, nor even the unfortunate Monsieur Soames, but a matter of simple timing. Poirot turned toward Reverend Pemberton, whose serene composure had not, until this moment, wavered in the slightest. Monsieur le Curé, you informed me, when first we spoke, that you had never previously made the acquaintance of Edmund Hartley Price beyond what idle gossip might supply. And yet I find myself troubled by a small inconsistency in your account of the evening's events, one which I did not press at the time, because I had not yet understood its significance. Pemberton's expression did not change, but something in his stillness sharpened, like a man listening for a footstep he half expects and wholly dreads. You told me you boarded the train at Halworth Junction in the ordinary way, with the rest of us, having purchased your ticket that same evening. Poirot's voice remained mild, almost apologetic, though his eyes had taken on the bright, unblinking quality of a man closing in upon his quarry. Yet the station-master's records, which I examined not an hour ago, show that your ticket, monsieur, was purchased 3 days previous, and not for tonight's service alone, but for a return journey as well, booked under circumstances that suggest considerably more foreknowledge of this evening's events than a chance encounter on a foggy platform would explain. The carriage had gone utterly silent. Even the constable at the door seemed to have ceased breathing. I think, Monsieur Pemberton, Poirot said softly, that it is time you told us the truth. Chapter 10. The Mask Slips. For a long moment, the Reverend Josiah Pemberton said nothing at all. His hands, folded so serenely throughout the long night, had gone white at the knuckles where they gripped the small black volume in his lap, and Hastings, watching, saw the first crack appear in a composure that had seemed, until this very instant, utterly unassailable. I see no crime in purchasing a ticket in advance, Monsieur Poirot, he said at last, though the easy warmth had drained entirely from his voice, leaving something flatter and more careful in its place. A clergyman's duties take him about the country with some regularity. There is nothing sinister in foresight. Non, monsieur, there is nothing sinister in foresight alone, but there is something considerably more troubling in foresight combined with falsehood. You told me you had never previously met Edmund Hartley Price. Yet I have learned, in the course of this morning's inquiries, that the parish register of St. Aldhelms, your own parish, monsieur, as you yourself informed Inspector Maddox not 3 hours ago, records a rather different history. Edmund Hartley Price was, until some 18 months past, a regular and generous benefactor of that very parish. He sat upon its restoration committee. He dined, on more than one occasion, at the vicarage. Coincidence does not constitute acquaintance, Pemberton said, but the words came too quickly now, and without their earlier serenity. It would not, monsieur, if it stood alone, but I think it does not stand alone at all. I think Edmund Hartley Price withdrew his patronage from your parish some 18 months ago, rather abruptly, and I think this withdrawal followed a discovery he made, a discovery concerning certain irregularities in the parish accounts, irregularities that a less scrupulous man than yourself might have hoped would remain forever buried beneath the ordinary dust of church bookkeeping. The Reverend's face had gone the color of old parchment. You cannot prove such a thing. I do not need to prove it this moment, monsieur. The auditors will do that work in time, and do it thoroughly. What I required, until now, was only to understand why a clergyman of evident respectability should find himself aboard a midnight train with a man he claimed to scarcely know, carrying a ticket purchased 3 days before the man's death was ever contemplated by anyone but its architect. Poirot's voice had not risen, had not once departed from its mild, conversational register, and yet the effect upon the carriage was that of a man slowly tightening a vise. Hartley Price discovered your theft, monsieur. He did not expose you publicly. A mercy, I think, that you did not extend to him in return, but he made plain that his silence would not endure forever, and that restitution, complete and immediate, was the price of his continued discretion. You did not have the sum required. And so you required, instead, a different solution entirely. This is conjecture, Pemberton said, but his voice had thinned to something brittle, and his eyes, for the first time since Hastings had observed him, moved restlessly about the carriage, as though seeking an exit that did not exist. It is conjecture built upon facts, monsieur, which is the only sort of conjecture in which I permit myself to indulge. You required a man with access to Hartley Price's compartment, a man already known to you, perhaps through your pastoral duties, a man fallen into hardship and grateful for whatever small service might ease his circumstances. Albert Soames, I think, owed you a debt of gratitude from some earlier kindness, perhaps a recommendation to his position upon this line, perhaps something graver still, and you called upon that debt tonight, asking him to deliver a brandy laced with poison to a man he had no quarrel with himself, and no understanding of why he was asked to do it. Mrs. Denholm gave a small, involuntary sound, her hand flying to her mouth. He did not know, Poirot continued, more gently now, what the brandy contained, until it was already done, and the horror of his unwitting part in a murder sent him fleeing into the fog, rather than face what he had become, however innocently, an instrument of. That, monsieur le curé, is the truth I believe lies beneath your silence. I ask you now, before this company, to confirm or deny it. The Reverend Pemberton said nothing at all, but his silence, in that moment, was answer enough for everyone present. Chapter 11. The Reveal. It was Inspector Maddox who broke the silence at last, stepping forward with the grim satisfaction of a man whose patience, however strained, had finally been rewarded. Reverend Pemberton, I must ask you to— Wait, Inspector, I beg you. One moment more. Poirot raised a hand, and something in his expression, a faint, troubled crease about the eyes that had not been there a moment before, caused even Maddox to pause. I find, monsieur le curé, that your silence answers one question while leaving another entirely unresolved. And it is this second question that has, in truth, occupied my little grey cells most persistently throughout this long night. Pemberton said nothing, but his eyes, wary now as a cornered animal's, fixed upon Poirot with something between dread and a curious, desperate hope. You have given Albert Soames a task he did not understand and could not refuse, owing some debt of gratitude that bound him to your service. This much I believe is true, and I believe the auditors will confirm in time the matter of the parish accounts that drove you to such desperate measures. But I do not believe, monsieur, that you administered the poison with your own hand, nor even that you selected cyanide as your instrument, for these require a particular knowledge that a country clergyman, however troubled, does not commonly possess. What do you mean? Carfax demanded, his earlier indignation forgotten entirely in the press of new revelation. I mean, monsieur, that cyanide is not so easily obtained as the detective novels would have us believe, and that the precise quantity required to kill a healthy man within minutes, not so little as to merely sicken him, not so much as to leave residue easily detected before the act was complete, is a calculation requiring expertise. A clergyman troubled by debt and discovered embezzlement might conceive the wish to silence his accuser. He would not, I think, conceive the means so precisely, nor procure the substance itself without leaving some trace of inquiry that careful investigation would eventually uncover. Poirot's gaze, which had rested upon Pemberton throughout this speech, now moved with slow and terrible deliberation toward another figure entirely, one who had sat throughout the long night in near total silence, eyes fixed upon the floor, hands trembling in a lap that had, until this moment, drawn far less of the company's attention than his stillness perhaps deserved. "Monsieur Finch," Poirot said softly, "I think it is time we spoke of your true profession." Gerald Finch's head came up sharply, and for the first time since boarding the train at Halworth, Hastings saw something other than fear in the young man's face, a flash of something colder, more calculating, swiftly suppressed but not, Hastings thought, swiftly enough. "I don't know what you mean," Finch said, but the words carried none of the conviction his earlier silence had at least suggested. "I mean, monsieur, that you are no idle traveller with no connection to this affair, as you would have me believe. I mean that you trained, I think, as a chemist, perhaps at one of our better universities, perhaps abroad, before circumstances I have not yet uncovered brought you into the orbit of a desperate clergyman with a debt he could not pay, and an enemy he could not otherwise silence. I mean that it was you, Monsieur Finch, who supplied the poison Reverend Pemberton lacked the knowledge to procure himself, and you who instructed an unwitting dining-car attendant in the precise manner of its delivery, while keeping your own hands and your own name entirely absent from the transaction. This is absurd, Finch said, but his voice had risen, cracking at its edges. You have no proof of any of this. Nothing but speculation and theatrics. I have, monsieur. Rather more than speculation. Poirot's voice, for the first time that night, took on an edge of genuine steel beneath its habitual courtesy. I have a vial that was placed, not hidden, where it would condemn an innocent man, placed by someone with the foresight to consider how an investigation might unfold, and the knowledge of chemistry to understand precisely how much residue such a vial should retain to be convincing without arousing undue suspicion regarding its origin. Reverend Pemberton could not have managed such a detail. You, Monsieur Finch, I think, could have managed it without difficulty at all. The carriage had gone utterly, breathlessly still, every eye fixed upon the young man whose mask, piece by piece, had begun at last to fall away. Chapter 12. The Truth Revealed. For a long moment, Gerald Finch sat frozen, his eyes darting between Poirot's unwavering gaze and the constable now stationed, with quiet purpose, before the only door. Then, all at once, something in him seemed to collapse inward, the careful blankness of his expression giving way to something raw and, finally, unguarded. He was going to ruin everything, Finch said, his voice low and bitter. Not just Pemberton, me. I was his assistant, 2 years past, cataloguing manuscripts for his collection. I found an error in his attributions, a forged provenance on a piece he'd sold for a small fortune to a museum in Geneva. I said nothing at the time. I needed the position, the reference, the money, but Hartley Price learned that I knew, and he used it, dangled the threat of exposure over me for 2 years, demanding I falsify other provenances to protect his reputation, making me complicit in fraud after fraud, until I could see no way out that did not end in my own ruin alongside his. And it was through this work, Poirot said quietly, that you came to know Reverend Pemberton. Pemberton came to me 8 months ago. He'd heard, through parish circles, of my situation, my resentment. He had his own grievance against Hartley Price by then, the accounts, the threatened exposure. We discovered we wanted the same thing, though neither of us, I think, could manage it alone. He found Soames, desperate, indebted to him for some old kindness I never fully understood. I provided what Soames lacked the knowledge to obtain, and what Pemberton lacked the stomach to administer himself. Finch's hands, no longer trembling now that the pretense had fallen away, lay still in his lap. It was meant to look like a man's heart simply failing him. We did not anticipate the smell. We did not anticipate you, Monsieur Poirot. Few do, monsieur, Poirot said, not unkindly. And it is generally their undoing. He turned to Maddox. Inspector, I believe your arrest is now considerably better founded than it was an hour ago, though I would suggest 2 names upon the warrant rather than 1, and a search for Albert Soames conducted with rather more urgency, for I think you will find him not a fugitive from justice, but a man in genuine fear for his life, who knew rather more than was safe for him to know, and fled rather than be made to answer for a crime committed, in truth, without his understanding of its full purpose. Maddox, recovering his professional composure, stepped forward at last to formally caution both men, while the constable moved to assist. Reverend Pemberton, Hastings noted, had aged a decade in the course of a single conversation, his earlier serenity replaced by the hollow exhaustion of a man whose careful construction of respectability had finally, irreversibly, come apart. Reginald Carfax, Poirot said, turning to the still-shaken export merchant as the 2 accused men were led away. You owe Monsieur Hartley Price's memory nothing, given his evident willingness to let you hang for a debt that was, after all, no greater sin than poor judgment in business. But you owe yourself, perhaps, rather better company in your future investments. Carfax managed a weak, grateful laugh, the first genuine sound of relief Hastings had heard from him all night. Later, as the train at last resumed its delayed journey toward London, the fog entirely lifted and the pale morning sun spilling gold across the frosted fields, Hastings settled into his seat with the particular satisfaction of a man who had witnessed justice properly served. I confess, Poirot, I never suspected Finch at all. His silence seemed nothing more than shyness. Ah, Hastings, that is precisely why it served him so well. The loud man, the agitated man, these we suspect immediately, because their fear announces itself. But the truly dangerous mind understands that silence, properly maintained, invites sympathy rather than scrutiny. It was not Monsieur Finch's trembling hands that betrayed him in the end, mon ami, but his failure to tremble at the one moment that mattered, when I named his profession, and he answered too quickly and with too much certainty for an innocent man merely startled by an absurd accusation. Hastings shook his head, smiling despite the long night's exhaustion. The little grey cells again. Toujours, mon ami. Poirot settled back against the cushions, closing his eyes with the contentment of a puzzle, well and truly solved. Toujours.